All right, it is being recorded. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our Conservation 101 workshop for landowners. And those of you listening to the recording, thank you for being interested in conservation. We're excited you're here. So my name is Sarah Nebel. I'm the outgoing executive director. Today is in fact my last day, but I am stepping in for Erin Kilbane, our stewardship coordinator, who just couldn't make a day and is taking over a lot of the projects moving forward. And we also have Erin Valentine, the incoming acting executive director, who is amazing and very talented, who will be one of your main contacts to talk to after today about any potential projects that we could do together to conserve more land in Anne Arundel County. So Erin's gonna kick us off, and then I'm gonna be in the middle, and then she'll come back in at the end, and we'll wrap up this this little workshop. So Erin, take it away. We'll
Sure.
manage slides.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Okay. So if we could skip to slide 1, perfect. So as Sarah said at the top there, we are recording the presentation today. And I'm going to give us the introduction and overview of scenic rivers and land trusts. Also a brief introduction to conservation easements. Then I will hand things off to Sarah, and she'll be talking about the financial benefits of conservation easements, including tax incentives and some cash incentive programs that are available to us. Let's see, so next slide. Thank you, Sarah. So Scenic Rivers Land Trust. We are the local land trust here in Anne Arundel County. This year, we celebrated the 35th anniversary of our very first conservation easement. We were founded in 1988, but we celebrate the anniversary of our first easement, which was recorded in 1989 on an easement along the Severn River. We were originally founded as the Severn River Land Trust, and then we've expanded over the years and now operate in nearly the entire county, with the exception of the Magathie River watershed, because the Magathie River Land Trust operates in that area. We are a private 501c3 nonprofit. That means we are not a government entity. We hold 80 conservation easements. We just closed on our 80th easement in August, which was 47 acres of forested land in Pasadena, which was very exciting for us. And that covers over 3,800 acres of land throughout the county. We are also a nationally accredited land trust, one of only a few land trusts in Maryland that are nationally accredited. And that means that we operate by maintaining the highest level of practices for governance and financial management and ethics that are expected of land trusts, and are set forth by the governing body, which is the Land Trust Accreditation Commission. So Scenic Rivers mission and vision, we actually just revised this year when we launched our new strategic plan for the years 2024 and 2027. The heart of our work remains the same, but they have kind of an updated, refreshed phrasing, I would say. So our mission is to conserve the special forests, farms, wetlands, and other natural areas that sustain Anne Arundel County. We like to emphasize that sustain part of our mission. And our vision, which is that we envision a landscape that supports and sustains thriving communities of wildlife and people. And our work is, of course, accomplished by working with landowners in our community to educate them on the value and benefits of conservation, and by then holding and facilitating land protection agreements or conservation easements. So let's see. What's next? So what is a land trust? A land trust is a nonprofit organization that can assist landowners who want to protect and conserve their undeveloped property. We do that through varied means, or, there are a lot of different models for land trusts, but at their core, we create and hold conservation easements, and then very importantly, we steward those conservation easements. So once we place an easement on the land, we are committed to that property forever. So the stewardship aspect of our work is, we think, the most important part of what we do. What we're in it for, really, in the end. And then another model, it's not one that we typically employ, is that some land trusts actually acquire land for conservation purposes and then hang on to the land and manage the land. That's hasn't been our model traditionally, but it is an option, and it's one that you will find some land trust and some of our neighboring land trusts in other counties. That is their primary model of conserving and preserving land. So why protect land? There are a lot of reasons to do that. But, at the top of the list are, the, benefits to our wider community that come from having a healthy balance of natural resources available to us, and the benefits that those natural resources provide, which include things like clean air, food security. I think we all learned very quickly during the early days of the COVID pandemic how delicate the food supply chain is. So having a close access to a local food source and food production is extremely important. So we need those lands that provide those sources of food to remain. We need diverse wildlife, and we need places for that wildlife to live. So that includes our forests, our wetlands, our meadows. And then, of course, something we think about quite a bit here in Anne Arundel County is our Chesapeake Bay. So, protected lands actually protect our waterways and the health of our waterways. And so something we like to say quite often here at Scenic Rivers is that private protected lands do the public good, because, even if, a conserved property doesn't provide public access, the public is still, benefiting from the presence of that conserved land because of the, services that the natural resources are providing to the community through clean air, clean water, and habitat for wildlife. So, and then we get to the maybe more complicated part of our work. Talking about the reasons for why we do work is pretty simple. The actual mechanics of what we do can become a little more complicated. But conservation easements are a legal agreement between a landowner and a nonprofit or a government entity. So those are kind of the two types of entities that are qualified to hold a conservation easement. So that's nonprofit like Scenic Rivers, or a government entity like Anne Arundel County or City of Annapolis or the state of Maryland. Those are, three government entities that I can think of that would also hold conservation easements, and a landowner. So who would be involved? You would have the grantor or the grantee. So your landowner, that would be an individual, an LLC. A government agency could also be the landowner. An example that I can think of would be Scenic Rivers' largest conservation easement is the Bacon Ridge Natural Area in Crownsville that is owned by Anne Arundel County and managed by Recreation and Parks. So the county is the grantor, and Scenic Rivers Land Trust and the Maryland Environmental Trust, we are the grantees. So as the land trust, we're the holder of the conservation easement, and the county government agency is the grantor of the easement in that case. So characteristics of a conservation easement. Very importantly, they are forever. All easements that Scenic Rivers places on a property are forever. So that's incredibly important. An easement can be on all or a part of a property. The last bullet point there is that they're customizable, which means when we start working with a landowner who's interested in conservation, we can, talk to you about your plans for your land and, decide what portion of your property you would like in conservation, and perhaps, allow for another portion of the property to be outside of the easement. Another obvious quality of a conservation easement is that it limits the use and structures on the property. But what is also great about a conservation easement is that it allows the landowner or the grantor to continue to own and use and enjoy their property, and manage it as they see fit, with the exception of the restrictions that are in the easement, and then sell it or pass it on to their heirs. And then the easement is attached to the land and not the owner. So the easement would remain in place once it's passed on or sold.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here and say that these easements are very customizable that we do we work off of a model template, but a lot of what we work out with the landowner is how they want to manage their land. And we work with them to make sure that how they want to manage their land also is protecting the conservation values that our mission is to protect. So they're very customizable. They're a little different from the regulatory easements that people might be familiar with from the county for Forest Conservation Act or something like that. Anything else to add, Erin? Or do you want me to
but I
take
think,
it
is
on
this
from
where
here?
I'm handing it over to you? I think so.
I think this is. All right, so Scenic Rivers minimum requirements. So our conservation program, we do have minimum requirements for what we will work on, so we're not protecting anything and everything. So we do have some minimum requirements. So one is a 10-acre minimum, and that is purely because we have limited resources here, limited staff time, limited money, and so we want to make sure we're making an appropriately sized impact for the work and resources that we're putting into a conservation easement. We'll talk more about the finances later, but it really, for us to do a 1-acre easement or a 500-acre easement is just about the same amount of work, interestingly. So we don't want to make sure we're getting a big bang for our allocated efforts. And so we do have some caveats to that. So we have 3 caveats. One is if there's going to be public access written into the conservation easement, significant public access that anyone could come to the property and enjoy the property, that is one exception. We will go very small for that because that is a very special value that is huge benefits to the public. A second caveat is if it is adjacent to existing protected land. So if it's right next to one of our other conservation easements, or if it's next to a state park or a county park, then we're happy to do an easement to add on to the collective effort of the conservation movement. So I know, a couple of years ago, we did a 3/4 of an acre easement because it was surrounded by 3 sides on an existing Scenic Rivers Land Trust easement. And then the third caveat is if there's rare, threatened, or endangered species living on the property, and that we believe that the species can thrive on that property with the amount of acreage that we're conserving, so that if it gets developed around there, that we can still have that habitat survive past, hopefully for forever, and that species doesn't go extinct. And we do need to meet our IRS standards and requirements by the code, especially if you want to take a tax deduction for this donation of a conservation easement, which we'll get into more. We try and really adhere to those. We are a 501c3, so we have rules of our own we need to adhere to. And then, of course, our mission is to protect the natural and open lands of Anne Arundel County, the Forest Farms wetlands. So we're not going to put a conservation easement on a parking lot and a shopping mall and things like that. So we want to have the majority of what we're conserving, not a built environment. And then the last thing, of course, is a willing landowner. So we very, very rarely work on regulatory easements that are required. We much prefer to work on voluntary easements when the landowner is very interested in just giving or selling a conservation easement without any attachments to any other development somewhere else or anything like that. So it's a voluntary program that we run that our donors fund, and that's what we really enjoy doing. So speaking of the Internal Revenue Code, so in 170H, there are 4 conservation purposes that qualify a conservation easement for a tax deduction, because it now qualifies as a charitable donation. So one of them is the preservation of space for outdoor recreation or education by the public. So again, that's one of our caveats for our 10-acre minimum, and that's also a conservation purpose. So that can be one reason to take a deduction. Another one is protection of relatively natural habitat for fish, wildlife, other ecosystems. And so again, that's your forest, farms, wetlands on a property. This is one of our most commonly used conservation purposes in our easements. And the third one is the preservation of open space for scenic enjoyment or pursuant to a federal, state, or local government conservation policy. So often, if it's viewable from a public road or from a public waterway, navigable waterway, then we can include scenic enjoyment by the public. If you are not viewable from a road or the waterway, then we can't do this one, which is totally fine. And often we will use that it's pursuant to a local or state conservation policy. So for agriculture or protecting forest land, something similar, very common conservation purposes. And then the one that we rarely do is preservation of historically important land or a certified historic structure. So we do often land conservation, and we'll do historically significant land. So for example, for a Native American significant area, or like a battlefield, those are significantly historically significant spaces. But for buildings, that's a lot of technical expertise that we rely on places like the Maryland Historical Trust to partner with us for doing buildings, since there is a lot more technical things that nature experts aren't necessarily have the skills for. So, and then the last big item for the IRC is that it's gifted to a qualified organization. So a land trust is a qualified organization, a government agency that has a mission to conserve is a qualified organization. If you just give it to your neighbor's LLC that he founded for his restaurant business, that does not count as a qualified organization. So terms and provisions of a typical conservation easement. So if you think about a property and it's the rights that go along with it of being a landowner of that property, you can think of all those rights as like a bundle of sticks, that you have the right to mine your property, the right to timber harvest your property, the right to have to build barns or sheds, the right to build a house. And all of those rights are kind of bundled together with that ownership. And with a conservation easement, you're giving us some of those sticks out of your bundle. You still keep most of the bundle and you keep the ownership of the land, but you're now giving us sticks or interest in the property through that conservation easement deed. So one of the main ones that we always restrict is the number of residences. So this is tied to the conservation easement valuation, financial valuation, which I'll talk about in just a couple minutes. And so we normally really restrict the number of residences, usually not to zero, unless it's a fairly small property, but usually up to about 50 acres, we allow just one house. Up to 100 acres, we may allow two houses, and so on. We like limiting the number of residences, and we usually restrict subdivision so that we just have one parcel with one landowner to deal with. And it makes stewardship much easier when it isn't allowed to be subdivided. Public access, never required. We would love it if a landowner is interested in a public access component. If it's over 10 acres, if it's under 10 acres, that might be something that we say, hey, if you do want to protect your land, the only way that it would fit our conservation program criteria is if you allowed public access. And we wrote it into the conservation easement that you have to provide public access. But if it's over 10 acres, it's very clearly stated in the easement that this easement does not give public access to the public. One thing that we never restrict or require restrictions for is hunting. The science just changes all the time on what you should or should not be hunting in a dynamic ecosystem like a forest. So deer hunting is never restricted. We just rely on the current science and the current laws to put restrictions on hunting in certain areas. Industrial and commercial activities. Industrial is always fully prohibited on a conservation easement. Commercial activities, it really depends. This is one of the highly negotiated and often very unique to that property and that easement of what commercial activities we allow and don't allow and where. For some easements, it's just we allow commercial activities in the buildings. Some it's within a certain area. So it really depends on what the landowner's plan for the property is. And it could be certain commercial uses are allowed on the entire property, like if you have a farm. So that leads into the next one, agriculture. So we tend not to put rules around agriculture. We'll require a 100-foot buffer around water bodies. But other than that, we like to encourage agriculture. So we keep the easement pretty, doesn't speak much to it because again, the science changes so often on how you should be really practicing agriculture. And then the last one is a timber harvest. We don't fully prohibit timber harvest unless the landowner wants to. Maybe the landowner wants to see this forest turn into a old growth forest, and that sounds fantastic to us. So we'll restrict commercial timber harvest and we'll only allow them for the health of the forest. So say there might be a disease coming through or something like that, where a forester is recommending for the long-term health of the forest that you have a timber harvest. But we can also, depending on the landowner, allow commercial selective timber harvesting. We often don't allow clear cutting for harvesting just because it really does disturb the ecosystem. So forest management plans, your timber harvest, your selective timber harvest, if that's written into your easement, it will have to follow a forest management plan. So these are created by a licensed forester, either a forester at DNR, or you can use a private forester. And often, if you have 5 acres or more of forest on your property, we're going to require a forest management plan that needs to be updated every 10 years or so. And it will include forest size and composition, suggestions for forest management, and often landowner goals. And so we have a whole section in our easement on what we need in a forest management plan to be approved by the easement. And if you don't want to do a conservation easement, maybe you're not ready to do to put a permanent conservation easement on your property, you might be able to put your property into a forest management plan and into a forest conservation and management agreement with the state. So the Maryland Department of Resources, they are happy to work with you to create a forest management plan that you follow. It's 15-year agreement, and you can have your property taxes frozen at a really low rate per acre, which could be help out with the property tax situation, but not make you fully commit to conservation long-term for your property if you don't know what your heirs want to do with it, or you don't know what you want long-term. But right now, forest is a good idea to keep your tax burden low. So speaking of tax burdens and financial incentives, easements can have financial value, especially in this county, if you have development rights left. And what a development right is the right to build a house. So if you can build a house on your property and you haven't yet, then that is very valuable. If you can build just up to 5 houses, that's $80,000 to $200,000 or $300,000, $80,000 to $200,000 or $300,000 per development right, possibly, depending on your land and what an appraisal says. So you can either donate that value to us as a 501c3, it can count as charitable donation, or you can sell that full value to us, provided we have the funding to be able to do that. Or what most often happens is a bargain. We do a bargain purchase. So the landowner sells us a portion of the value and then they donate the rest. So, and that percentage of what's donated and what's sold varies drastically. It could be 90% sold, or it could be 90% donated, or anywhere in between. And how we figure out how much an easement is worth is an appraisal. So we use a conservation easement appraisal is actually 2 appraisals in one. So when we asked an appraiser for a conservation easement appraisal, what we're doing is asking for an as is right now value of what the property is worth on fair market value for highest and best use, which often is building out as many houses as you can. And then the after value of a hypothetical situation of, if we put a conservation easement that restricts, the property's uses and the structures that could be built, including houses, what is the property's worth after all of those restrictions? And it's usually lower. And so the difference between the as is value and the hypothetical conserved value is like that delta is the value of the conservation easement. So if it was worth $500,000 today, and if you put a conservation easement on it, then afterwards it's worth $100,000. The difference between $500,000 and $100,000 is $400,000. So the $400,000 is the worth of the conservation easement. So for the IRS to accept your donation of $400,000, you will need a qualified appraisal by a qualified appraiser following USPAP appraisal standards. And the IRS will require you to get that no sooner than 60 days before recording the recordation of the easement in Anne Arundel County land records. And you need, of course, to have an appraisal with the documents that you file in your return for that year. So there's a lot more that goes into appraisals and what the IRS needs, but that's just the beginner stuff. We have plenty of information that we can give you on that. But of course, we're not tax advisors. And I will say that again and again, we're not tax advisors. We're not giving legal advice in this presentation. We're just giving you information as land trust staff. So federal income tax deduction, this is fairly generous that we got passed as a land trust community in 2015 or 2016, I believe. Previously, it was, these tax deductions were just, they were renewed every year that the laws would allow it, and now it's permanent, so this shouldn't change. So you can take 50% of your adjusted gross income in the when you donate the conservation easement. And if you can't use all of that tax deduction from your charitable donation in 1 year, you can carry it forward for 15 years or until you use it up. So most people can't take the entire tax deduction in 1 year because we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. Lucky you, good for you if you can, but most people can't. And if you're a farmer, you're actually eligible for up to 100% of your adjusted gross income to take a tax deduction. So you have to qualify as a farmer under IRS rules. So just be careful about that. Then there's also the state income tax credit. So not a deduction, but a credit, which is different. So that's, everyone likes tax credits a little bit better than they like tax deductions. So you can get a credit up to $5,000 per year for each individual landowner. And that can total over the years up to $80,000 or the value of the conservation easement. And if you want to take this tax credit, it has to be held or co-held by the Maryland Environmental Trust, and their minimum acreage requirement for easements is 25 acres. So we work with the Maryland Environmental Trust quite a bit. About a third of our easements are co-held with MET, as we call them. And this is a really great tax benefit that you can glean. So there's also estate tax benefits if your property and you have estate taxes that you have to pay. There are some really helpful ways that a conservation easement can reduce the value of the land, so it doesn't count as much on your taxes. And there's a couple other things that you can get some exclusions. This is all complicated tax information, so I suggest talking to your tax advisor about all of this. But I just wanted to mention that there are some estate tax benefits. And then much more commonly used is the property tax reduction. So in this county, you can take up to 100% property tax reduction for the unimproved land subject to a conservation easement in this county if you donated your conservation easement. If you did a bargain sale, so you donated a portion and you sold a portion, you can only get a property tax reduction for the donated portion value, donated percentage of the value of your easement. And again, this is a slide just so that we have proof that we are not tax advisors or legal advisors. We are not giving legal advice. None of this should be represented as tax or legal advice, and you should most definitely seek your own tax and legal counsel when you're contemplating a conservation easement, which is a real estate transaction. So you definitely want some advisors if you are not a professional in this field already. So to speak of some of the costs of a conservation easement, because we are talking about a real estate transaction. So for us, if we're gonna buy all or a portion of the value, we'll get an appraisal. If a landowner wants to donate the easement, then they would need to purchase an appraisal for their tax for their tax forms. We may need a survey if the survey is older than 20 years for your property. So depending on funding, we may ask you to do a survey, or we may be able to cover the survey depending on the funding sources. We will get a title report and possibly title insurance if we're buying the property, buying the conservation easement, which we won't ask you to cover. There will be a forest management plan that if we have the funding to cover the cost of a forest management plan, we certainly will. We usually work with DNR foresters because they're significantly less expensive to have them write a plan than a private forester. So a DNR forester can write a plan for $250 or to $350. A private forester, you're probably paying significantly more than $1,000 for an FMP. And then each side will need to be responsible for their attorneys or other professional advisors. We cannot get grants to cover your legal costs. That's never in any of the grant programs that we apply to. So just be aware that you will need to do that. And then we also have, we have our own staff costs that we need to cover. We have a stewardship endowment contribution because that we have to contribute to our own stewardship endowment that we hold. We have to steward these easements in perpetuity, which we will talk about. And so to meet our national accreditation standards, we need to have at least $3,500 in that endowment for each easement that we hold. And we also have legal defense reserves to make sure that we can enforce our easements. So we put $2,000 away for each easement. For donated easements, we only ask landowners to cover a portion of these contribution values. If the conservation easement is funded by a grant, we'll be asking the grant funding to cover these costs. And so it really depends on the funding situation on how this all works out. So let's run through a couple examples of how this could work. So let's talk donated easements first. So let's say Lisa has 60 acres. She has one house on it already, but she knows because of zoning that she could build 2 more houses if she wanted. And an appraisal says the land is worth $600,000 before we put the conservation easement in place. And the appraisal says the land is worth only $200,000 after the easement is in place. So therefore, the easement value is $400,000. So the financial breakdown looks like this. So for her expenses to donate the property, it's $4,000 to get that appraisal to justify what she's claiming as a charitable donation and trying to take a tax deduction for. She gave us $1,000 for our stewardship contribution, and we have other donors from being able to cover the rest of the contributions to our legal defense and stewardship fund. She paid $300 for a forest management plan and about $1,200 in legal fees. So all told, she spent $6,500 to put a conservation easement on her property. She gets some, that's not a small chunk of change, but she gains huge benefits in terms of tax deductions and tax credit. So a $320,000 income tax deduction, an $80,000 tax credit that, over the next 15 years, reduced property taxes, and just, what most people enjoy greatly is the comfort knowing her land will be forever conserved and that the special forest that she has will stay there for forever and no one can tear it down legally. And so since this is a lower value property, it makes it easier to pass on to her children if she has, if state estate taxes come into play. So what if you are not in the financial situation, or you're just not inclined to donate a conservation easement? That is fairly common. We always have a mix of donated easements and easements that we need to either buy or get a bargain buy. So there are plenty of incentive programs, grant programs to help cover the cost of a land trust or government agency buying a conservation easement from a landowner. So there are grant programs just to protect forest, there are ones to protect farm, or either. So there are programs at the counties, state, and federal level, all supporting land conservation. So the one we use the most is a Chesapeake Bay Trust grant program, which is a 501c nonprofit that is a grant manager and funnels money across the Chesapeake Bay watershed to conserve and restore the Chesapeake Bay. So this grant program, which is called the Forestry and Forested Land Protection Grant Program for Anne Arundel County, which is a little bit of a long name, but it is very accurate. It's funded by Anne Arundel County, managed by the Chesapeake Bay Trust, and they have 3 tracks. So one, plant trees on already protected land. So maybe not a conservation easement, but if you already had an easement on a property, they'll pay you to plant trees on that one. And protect forest land. So this is a common one that we use this grant program for. And then the 3rd track is protecting land and planting trees on it. So we've used this a couple of times. So we've had some properties where part of it is forested, part of it is hay fields. And so the landowner was interested in converting some of those fields into fields into forest. So that fully funds that. So the grant program can pay a minimum of $3,850 according to the last RFP, or a request for proposals, for that grant, that latest grant cycle. It can be more with appraisals. So if your property is worth, if the easement is worth $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 or even $15,000, we can justify that with an appraisal, and the grant program will pay a higher cost per acre. If you don't want to get an appraisal, or if we don't want to get an appraisal and you only want, say $2,000 or $3,000 per acre, and we don't need an appraisal, and that makes everything easier. They incentivize tree planting, so they'll pay the landowner just a one-time payment of definitely a higher cost per acre, so $8,800 just to let us plant trees. So landowner gets a lump sum, and then they'll cover all the costs of the replanting, the trees themselves, the maintenance, the labor to plant the trees, all of that. And then this grant program will also pay all the rest of our costs, the surveys, the appraisals, our staff time, our stewardship and legal defense contributions. Everything's covered by the grant. So the only thing the landowner is worrying about is their own legal fees, and then they're also getting paid for the conservation easement itself, and the tree plantings. So let's go through an example for this. So say Lawrence has 40 acres, half of it is in forest, which is this little green rectangle here, and half of it is in field, which is the yellow part. It's zoned rural agriculture, so only one house per 20 acres. He wants to protect all but 5 acres of land, and he just wants his house excluded because he doesn't want us telling him what he can or can't do with his house, which is perfectly fine. Then he's going to put 35 acres into a conservation easement. Maybe he's done with his fields. They're not very active. He'd much rather get paid for planting trees. So we include a tree planting cost for 15 acres. And he's not going to worry about getting an appraisal just by how the math works out for the zoning. So it's, this is how we're thinking about it. The red line is where the easement boundary is, and then we're going to convert all of that yellow into a new forest, which is kind of exciting. So here's what we would make the grant application look like in terms of financials. So we would submit the grant application, we can write the grant application, and we'll just have the landowner look at it before we submit it so that they agree with what it says. So we're gonna write in, let's say he only wants $2,000 per acre. We could go much higher than that, but just for simplicity of an example, let's say we're gonna get $40,000 for him for the 20 acres of forest, and we're going to get $5,500 an acre for the tree planting. So that's $82,500 just to let us plant the trees. So we'll also include our drafting and our stewardship and legal defense costs, our title search costs, the cost of the plantings, and the tree planting labor and the trees themselves, and 2 years worth of maintenance. This grant asks for us to maintain the tree plantings for 2 years at no cost to the landowner. That would all be covered by the grant program. And it'll also cover the forest management plan and the survey to delineate exactly where that conservation easement goes. So Lawrence receives $122,500 for putting his property into a conservation easement and letting those trees be planted, and his only cost is his legal fees, which honestly, legal fees vary drastically. So it could be, only a couple $100s. It could be thousands of dollars, depending on who you hire and how much you ask them to, look at the conservation easement, how long you talk to them for. So another example is Rosa. So let's just say she owns 100 acres, 70 of forest, 30 of fields. There's no house on it yet. And she knows she has 5 development rights remaining, and she wants the entire property protected. But she does want to retain the ability to build one house, so she wants to retain one development right. So we're going to delineate a building area of exactly, like, she can build her house in that, blue building area, and that way we can promise protection of the forest and just have her build her house in the field. And so that is a common thing that we put into a lot of our easements, where the landowner has bought the property, they haven't built their house yet, but they want to put a conservation easement in it. So we just delineate these building areas. This is very helpful for the IRS to be happy with the conservation easement too. So because Rosa is a realtor, she thinks the easement is worth $800,000, which would be $8,000 per acre. So this conservation easement only pays for forested lands, not agricultural lands. So we're going to write into the easement to pay her $8,000 for 70 acres. And so that's $560,000. And then we'll also write in all the typical fees and costs that we have. So she receives $560,000. We get all of our costs covered and the cost of the easement covered. And she just has her legal fees. And then sometimes we ask the landowner to cover appraisals, sometimes we don't. So if we do ask her to cover the cost of the appraisal, so we'll ask her to give that money to us, and then we'll hire the appraiser. More often, we're just getting the appraisal these days and not having the landowner cover that cost. But if we do ask her because of a certain circumstance, we'll reimburse her after the easement is recorded. So Rosa's tax incentives. So this is a bargain purchase, right? So the grant would only cover a portion of the value of the easement. Her easement, which was justified by an appraisal at, luckily, is worth $800,000. If we pay her $560,000, she is donating $240,000 to us when she gives us the easement. So she can have, that can be her federal income tax deduction. She can also get that tax credit of $5,000 per year, and she can also get partially reduced property taxes. Now, how the state tax credit plays with the federal tax deduction, you'll have to talk to a tax advisor about. But these are the options that she has for some tax incentives, which is pretty good. It's nice. So to talk about some funding programs, so the county manages the Agriculture and Woodland Preservation Program. So this is MALF, as we call it, the Maryland Agricultural Preservation Foundation. There's also the County Ag and Woodland Preservation Program, and also Rural Legacy. So this is all different funding programs that have similar requirements, but not exactly the same. So the main requirements are you need at least 50 acres, 50-acre property that you want to conserve, and then you need some certain soil types of class 1, class 2, or class 3. They all are a little different, but they're trying to protect the highest soil for farming, essentially, is what these programs are trying to do. And generally, there is a requirement that you need at least one development right to give up for them to purchase. These are purchase programs, so they don't cover the cost of a donated easement. They want to reduce development rights. So, and like the rural legacy area really only wants to work where it's grayed out. So a lot of this, for this county, rural legacy funding really only flows to South County, and only a portion of it. Hopefully this rural legacy area can be expanded. Keep our fingers crossed for that. And another one is program open space. So there's stateside and county side. So stateside we've worked with before. Hopefully you can't hear the leaf blower out my window. And they're looking for, the state side is looking for 50 acres or more, and they will pay like all of the costs associated with it, except for, of course, landowner legal fees and advisor fees, and they don't require public access. So they can do a conservation easement, or they can buy the property outright from you. The county typically just buys property in fee simple to add it to their park system, because they do have a public access requirement with it. But the county is a viable option for selling land to conserve it. So for stateside, DNR is very, they're very targeted in what they're trying to protect, and they're trying to add and grow their own, add to their existing conservation projects or existing state park system too. So it works best when it's a possible conservation project is really close to one of their parks. And then Forest Legacy, that's a very specific federal program that is very, very competitive. So we need big acreage to be competitive on the federal scale when you're competing with Georgia and Idaho, where the land cost per acre is very low and the number of acres is very high. So we're looking for at least 100 to 300 acres or more. And it only pays 75% of the easement value. So Forest Legacy funded easements don't happen often in the state, and they definitely don't happen often in Anne Arundel County. I think the last one in Anne Arundel County was 10 years or more ago. So there's also REPI. So the Naval Academy has a REPI area, which is a Readiness Environmental Protection Initiative. So they're trying to protect their base, and they understand that the environment definitely affects the operation of their base. So they're looking to provide some public access or some climate resiliency for that naval base. So the timelines for being able to get an easement done varies widely. So for a donated easement, that's easiest. We don't have to wait for any funding to come through. We don't have to do any grant reporting. Fastest I've done an easement is in 4 months. Sometimes it takes 12. It depends on how fast contractors can work and how fast lawyers can get back to us and how quickly negotiations between us and the the landowner are. With the Chesapeake Bay Trust grants, it's usually a minimum of 10 months just by the lag of the grant manager being involved in terms of applying for the grant, waiting to hear back, submitting grant reports to get funding, and waiting for them to supply that funding, which not only takes a couple of weeks, but it does start to add up. So usually that's like a 10 to 20 month process. Stateside program open space is 2 to 3 years, sometimes 4 or 5 or more. And if you go to the state level, be ready. You're in for the long haul here. You'll probably be waiting 2 to 5 years or more for everything to get into place. So for conservation easement stewardship, putting a conservation easement in place is just the beginning. It is a lot of work at the beginning to place a conservation easement, at least from our side. But that just is the start. So our commitment to the public is to, steward these conservation easements and enforce them to make sure those conservation values are protected forever. So we monitor every single year. We keep records to be able to legally enforce these easements. We manage, we have the management of those endowments and reserve funds. And there's some administrative burden in terms of, I shouldn't call it a burden. It's, there is staff time allocated and dedicated towards talking to landowners about questions about their easements or what they want to do with their property and seeking approvals when they need to, so that landowner can basically manage the land and adhere to the conservation easement. We really welcome open communication with our landowners because it is just so much easier to talk about something you're thinking about doing than to talk to you afterwards about what you did do and how it conflicts with the conservation easement. So I think I said most of this already. In terms of our ethical and legal responsibility, we do an annual monitoring visit to every single one of our easements every single year. So we'll come to the property, we'll give notice that we're coming, we'll come to the property, we'll walk around, we'll take pictures, we might fly a drone, take pictures that way. It's a great time to walk the property with the landowner if they want to walk it with us. We don't need their presence, but it's always great to build that relationship. And it's a great time for them to ask us questions and us to understand what's happening on the property. And so staff does these, but also we train volunteers to be volunteer stewards to go out and monitor properties as well. We do have 80 and we only have a staff of 4. So it'll be 3 in just a couple of hours, but it'll go back to 4 very quickly. And so trying to get out to 80 conservation easements, which cover almost 4,000 acres, is a lot to do in 1 year. So we have volunteers help us. And so I've referenced this before, but we do promise perpetuity to the public, to the IRS, and to ourselves. So when a landowner violates the terms of the easement, we do have enforcement rights. We have standing in court to be able to enforce this easement. So we'll give, we start out slow and we'll escalate it as far as we need to, all the way up to suing the landowner to repair and restore the conservation values of the properties. That might mean taking down the house that you built that you weren't supposed to, or replanting trees if a landowner cut trees down where they were not supposed to, or if someone dumped on the property a bunch of tires, those need to be removed. The most common one is encroachments from other neighbors, so we do have the right to um, en enforce those boundaries to neighbors too. So um, the whole time I've been here for 9.5 years, we've never sued anyone. We've certainly sent letters letting people know that there is an issue and that it needs to be remedied. And so that usually is that's usually as far as we need to go and have to go. But that is what our legal defense fund reserve is for, in case we do need to go further. And also we have terra firma conservation defense insurance, so that in the hopefully very rare case that we need to sue a landowner for not adhering to the terms of the easement, then we have defense insurance that has a $500,000 cap. So we can certainly tap into that funding to be able to not deplete our reserves and still be able to enforce our easements. So Erin, I think this is your slide.
Sure. So just to recap the presentation for, what Sarah's covered, our conservation easements are, a fantastic way to permanently protect undeveloped land here in Anne Arundel County. It's a great way for landowners to, protect their land for many different reasons, but still hang on to their property. And there are financial and tax incentives available, and there are a lot of different programs available to you. And of course, Scenic Rivers is here to help. Easements there are a lot of details. They can be complicated. So we do, of course, suggest you bring advisors in to the process once you decide to go down that path. But, the first step is to, of course, call us, and, we can, start talking you through the process. The first, thing we want to hear from you is, what are your plans for your land? What are you thinking of doing in the future? And, what are your connections to your property? That's where we start. That's how we kick off the process. So.
Well, so we are recording this, so we're gonna stop the recording so we can answer questions and have people ask questions in a little more free environment. But thank you all so much for listening, and I hope this webinar is really helpful to you. And how do I stop recording? There we go.